I think maybe we'll get started. Maybe a few others will drift in. But my name is Phil Hawley, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. By way of very brief background, I'm a physician and a writer, and I'm currently a fellow at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, a gift for which I am exceedingly grateful to everyone at the center, but especially to Carter Sneed, whose prodigious intellect is matched, I discovered, by a conspicuously generous nature. I'm about to submit an expense report in a few days, so any of you who want to mention that I acknowledged him and his generosity are happy to do so. The title of our session, Mind, Body, Spirit, and State, well, as I thought about that, in its net, it captures a very large swath of moral philosophy. But in our session now, we're going to focus specifically on conscious rights, and in particular on the conscious rights of those who care for us during the most vulnerable moments of our life, healthcare professionals. Specifically, I think I've read the abstracts. One of the questions, at least for me, implicit in both of the presentations today is, in the coming years, is a pluralistic moral society going to make room for those healthcare professionals who are guided by a deeply held faith? And today, the speakers will be speaking about Christian faith, but it could apply to any of those. Before I go on, let me mention, by the way, that our third speaker, Wesley Smith, had something come up and, for very good reasons, had to cancel at the last minute. And he asked me specifically to extend his apology to those who might have come to see him speak. He wishes he could be here. And also, I'd like to make an apology to the theologians and philosophers in the room, such as Father Flannery, who might be asking themselves, why is Phil, a mere pediatrician, chairing this session on a subject that plumbs the depths of moral philosophy? And I have to admit, I have the same question. When I arrived as a freshman at Notre Dame in 1970, my father's advice advised me to list out my career options, so I always had those in mind as I went through college. Well, it was about this point in the middle of my freshman year, and I carried this list in my wallet. At that point, I received back my midterm, my graded midterm, from my philosophy professor, and saw that my grade was none of the first several letters in the alphabet. And I realized I did not have a gift for abstract thinking, and crossed off the theology and philosophy from the list. But had a wonderful career in pediatrics, so that worked out providentially for me. Well, our speakers have none of my deficiencies. In fact, they both have great aptitude in abstract thinking, and I think you'll really enjoy hearing what they have to say, as I did reading about what they're going to say. So let me introduce our first speaker, Loris Kaljian, Dr. Loris Kaljian. Loris is well known to those of you who have attended conferences here in the past. He is one of our most popular speakers, and as one friend put it one time, she said, he has such a mellifluous speaking style that I'd be perfectly content to listen to him recite the contents of the telephone book. That was exactly her comment, but his qualifications go far beyond that. And Loris is both a PhD and a medical doctor, and he's director of the program in bioethics and humanities at the University of Iowa, Carver College of Medicine, where he's professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and holds the Richard M. Kaplan Chair in Biomedical Ethics and Medical Humanities. He received his medical degree from the University of Michigan and a master's in divinity and PhD in Christian ethics from Yale University. He completed his residency and fellowship training at Yale in internal medicine and infectious disease, and he's been at the University of Iowa since 2000. His research interests focus on the goals of care, end-of-life decision-making, disclosure of medical errors, ethics education, the role of philosophical and religious beliefs in medicine, practical wisdom in medicine, of which he has a great deal, and conscientious practice among healthcare professionals. His paper is titled Conscientious Practice, Religious Freedom, and the Sovereignty of God.
All right. Thank you very much, Phil, for that gracious introduction, and thank you all for being here first thing in the morning. And I want, if I may, just say a particular gratitude to David Solomon, who just joined us this morning, not just because of the fact that he's well known to all of you for being the founding leader of this enterprise here, but because of his particular graciousness to me once upon a time, many years ago now, when I landed in his office to introduce myself and to find out whether I could, shall we say, become an adopted member of the Notre Dame family. And I'm pleased to say that his generosity has allowed me to be here up until this very day. So without further ado, let me begin here and say that the moral pluralism of Western democratic societies results in serious ethical differences, and as we know, not only among citizens in our society at large, but also among healthcare professionals. The sources of these differences run to the roots of our convictions, where they are embedded in the foundational beliefs and values that give our lives meaning and purpose. Sometimes serious ethical differences create conflicts in healthcare, as happens when a patient seeks access to a legal medical service that a physician believes is unethical. When such conflicts arise, they raise questions about the extent to which society believes physicians have a professional duty to facilitate access to, if not provide, controversial medical practices. The professional act of referral, it's got a technical meaning actually in the medical world, but you can see at face value what it's getting at. This professional act of referral is therefore a focal point of discussion. And people disagree as to whether or not an unwilling physician should be required to refer a patient to a willing physician under such circumstances. As many of you know, this question of referral draws our attention to the ethics of cooperation, that area of moral concern that addresses what it means to be complicit with actions and intentions that are believed to be unethical, and in the setting of healthcare, not in the patient's best interest, at least as judged by the clinician involved. To illustrate, consider the following legal case from the Canadian province of Ontario. A group of Christian physicians and their supporting organizations challenged a mandate by the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons that requires them to provide an effective referral, as defined in their mandate, for services to which these physicians conscientiously object. The court decided against the objecting physicians, claiming that the public's access to healthcare services justified placing limits on doctors' rights of religious freedom. It is notable that the court agreed that the effective referral policy infringed the rights of religious freedom of the physicians as guaranteed under Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but the court nevertheless decided against the physicians, claiming that the requirements imposed by the government, quote, represent reasonable limits on religious freedom, end quote, noting that, quote, the protection of life and public safety far outweigh any deleterious effect in the form of infringement of the rights of the physicians to practice medicine in accordance with their religious beliefs. Infringements which, by the way, the court believed would likely be trivial or insubstantial. That case, I'm pleased to say, is currently under appeal and will probably be heard, I believe, at the beginning of next year. The weighing of interests in this case illustrates a presumption that favors a patient's right to access services and disfavors a physician's right to conscientious practice. It is a presumption that can also be found in some strong voices in the medical profession in the United States. The American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists maintain that conscientiously objecting physicians have a duty to refer their patients in a timely manner, and the American College of Physicians likewise affirms the need for referral to ensure that relevant information about treatment options is disclosed. The American Medical Association expresses a general presumption in favor of referrals, but recommends that when a physician declines to refer, he or she, quote, should offer impartial guidance to patients about how to inform themselves regarding access to desired services. So taking a step back more generally here, I would say that the degree of latitude society grants healthcare professionals to practice conscientiously is a reflection of the extent to which society takes two things seriously: the political legitimacy of moral pluralism and the moral value of conscientious practice. Regarding moral pluralism, there are compelling reasons in a democratic society to protect as much space as possible for conscientiously practicing professionals by creating accommodations that allow for ethical differences with respect to controversial practices. One of the reasons is that respect for the expression of professional integrity allows philosophical and religious diversity to serve as a source of critical appraisal that leads to better practices. The more freedom of conscience in the practice of medicine, the more opportunity to identify ethical disagreements that invite democratic processes that can craft solutions that are responsive to the interests of all patients, professionals, and citizens. To the extent that freedom of conscience is constrained, adverse professional and societal outcomes may ensue as professional or government control over morally controversial areas of medicine creates a uniformity of practice that stifles thinking. There's a parallel here between freedom of conscience and freedom of speech in light of the capacity each has to facilitate reflection, dialogue, and deliberation, processes that can help bring a society closer to the truth in matters that are controversial. Regarding conscientious practice, the questions that cause physicians to disagree about the extent of their professional duties to their patients bring us to ask what conscience is and how seriously we should take its protections. We give the name conscience to that deep aspect of our nature as moral persons, which according to the biblical narrative is part of our essence as creatures made in the image of God. As Joseph Ratzinger reflected, conscience is a kind of co-knowledge of man with God, from which arises the absoluteness with which conscience asserts its superiority over any and all authorities. Notions of conscience can also be described in philosophical terms that don't acknowledge God, but nevertheless communicate the significance of individual moral conscience as having irreplaceable value in human life and society. I would also suggest that the meaning of conscience is often represented by the word integrity, as we find, for instance, in the work of Beecham and Childress, the two authors most associated with the so-called four principles approach to biomedical ethics. They describe integrity as the soundness, reliability, wholeness, and integration of moral character, a description that is related to, though not as musically suggestive as, what Plato had to say at a time when virtues, rather than principles, were the order of the day. And as you can see there, it would be better for me to have a musical instrument or a chorus which I was directing in discord and out of tune, better that the mass of mankind should disagree with me and contradict me than that I, a single individual, should be out of harmony with myself and contradict myself. Images of integration and sounds of harmony help us comprehend what it means for a healthcare professional to practice conscientiously, to practice the science and art of healing in a way that makes a professional's actions consistent with his or her foundational beliefs and values. This integrity is the opposite of the divided self that Charles Taylor criticizes and which Alistair McIntyre associates with the problem of moral compartmentalization. Everyone at this conference knows the name Alistair McIntyre. I wonder how many of you all know this particular piece by him. And it's an extensive essay and profoundly well worth the reading. I strongly recommend it, especially for those of you who have not yet encountered this idea of moral compartmentalization. I use this to teach some medical students who take an elective course that I offer, and it is routinely very, very engaging and edifying for us all. In the United States, it's worth noting that the history of debates about the political implications of conscience has been closely related to concerns about religious faith and liberty. We see this in the historical use of the phrase sacred rights of conscience. The interweaving of matters of conscience with matters of religion reflects an overlapping concern about truth, meaning, and purpose, and how these shape our understanding of human dignity. While not dependent on a religious grounding as such, conscience has been so closely associated with religion that in the United States there has been historically a preferential treatment of specifically religious beliefs with respect to conscience. This is illustrated by the observation that the framers of the U.S. Constitution chose to protect the free exercise of religion rather than the free exercise of conscience. One additional and vital point to make about conscience has to do with its relationship to moral reasoning. There are those in our society and in my profession who would suggest or imply that conscience is a matter of personal beliefs and values, and therefore a private moral sensibility. By contrast, there are enduring traditions in philosophy and theology that would disagree and rightly acknowledge that conscience has multiple dimensions, one of which is rational, in addition to the emotional and motivational dimensions of conscience that is particularly well articulated by the philosopher C.D. Broad going back to 1940. If you agree with this three-dimensional view, you can see that conscientious practice inherently entails the ability to reason about ethical beliefs, virtues, principles, and outcomes. This moral reasoning can be communicated, of course, through dialogue with others. So notice what this implies. Conscience and integrity are fundamentally about ethics and ethical reasoning, not merely about personal feelings or preferences. Conscientious practice is therefore something to be engaged in relation to professional questions of ethics, not sequestered or marginalized as pertaining to private concerns or feelings. Conscience clauses in federal and state laws are the most formal ways of accommodating conscientious practice. When genuine, they serve as society's acknowledgement that in the setting of controversial practices, the freedom gained by some parties through legalization should not come at the cost of a compromised conscience for others. While we can be grateful for whatever good these laws accomplish, we also need to acknowledge their limitations. As some legal scholars argue, conscience clauses provide few meaningful mechanisms for ascertaining compliance and ensuring enforcement, and they are too limited in scope and receive too little respect from from courts. As a result, the right to conscientious practice in healthcare is believed to be a pressing public issue. I've put references here that are very helpful and reflect some of the leading legal voices in this debate. And also, I'd be happy to send my slides to anyone for these references if that would be helpful. You can just email me. We should share these concerns that these legal scholars have, not only because of the direct harms that healthcare professionals experience when they feel forced to cooperate in controversial medical practices, but also because of the central role that conscience plays in supplying the positive motivation that inspires conscientious professionals to commit their lives to serving the sick, especially when that commitment requires self-sacrifice, whether small or great. If the health professions are to flourish, the integrity of individual professionals needs to be sustained, and that requires professional and legal arrangements that accommodate physicians who have thought carefully about controversial medical practices and have concluded that they are conscience-bound to avoid participating in or making referrals for them. In the absence of such accommodations, we should expect increased moral distress among healthcare professionals and, as a further result, more burnout. And if you haven't seen headlines about the burnout literature in medicine just because you're not in that field, just do some Googling and you will find how prevalent this concern is and how much it's discussed in the medical professions. Burnout, you should also keep in mind, has different layers to it. It's got 3 different dimensions, one of which is emotional exhaustion. There's also cynicism. There's also lack of effectiveness. But moral distress certainly is often connected to the question of burnout, but one needs to be thoughtful in stratifying how it's related to the overall concept, which is to say that not everyone who's burnt out in medicine is burnt out because of moral distress. It's just one of the many features, but for some of us, it's actually the deepest source of the potential for that kind of burnout. Moving on now to even larger questions, or deeper, shall we say. When a society treats parties to an ethical disagreement respectfully, it finds a way to strike a proper balance between their interests. That balance will do more than simply acknowledge that certain policies infringe religious rights, as the Ontario court did. Rather, it will find ways to remedy those infringements and do so not out of a begrudging sense of tolerance, but from a deep awareness that human dignity is enhanced and democracy strengthened when such remedies are enacted. In doing so, it will also reveal something of the limits of state power in the face of religious belief and practice. As Michael McConnell has observed, when conscience clauses protect religious freedom, they acknowledge a profound tension, the tension between allegiance to God and obedience to the state. Moreover, these laws recognize a government's need to admit that if God exists and is sovereign, a government's claims on the obedience of its believing citizens is partial, not complete. This observation captures something of the truth about Christians that has been evident since the very beginnings of the church. Because the early Christians knew that there was only one true sovereign, and because they understood what it meant to live faithfully in this world, they knew they had to do 2 things at the same time. They had to live as model citizens of their various countries and as people owing allegiance to their new Lord. And because there was an ordered relationship between these 2 obligations, a priority scheme, they knew that whenever there was a conflict between obedience to God and obedience to earthly authorities, they had to obey God. Perceiving the ordered relationship between God and state can be seen as one of the many manifestations of the life of virtue that Augustine maintained was a life of rightly ordered love, that ordo amoris, which gave ethics in Western Christianity an organizing priority, love of God, neighbor, self, and the world. When properly tuned to this organizing priority, conscientious practice does not deny the rightful place of state power, but it subordinates our respect for the state and its laws to our love for God and our submission to His sovereign goodness and loving care. Conscientious practice presents a challenge that is both personal and societal. My remarks this morning have focused more on the former, but the latter concern is real. How does society or the medical profession determine whether a given practice should be considered morally controversial, and whether a threat to the liberty of a patient justifies legal constraints on the liberty and conscience of a physician? The way forward along this ethical and societal terrain is surely challenging, and it requires an enduring commitment to dialogue and deliberation within professional and political communities aimed at calibrating shared expectations and determining where the boundary lines of individual professional freedom of conscience should be drawn. By demonstrating respect for a physician's moral integrity, accommodations like conscience clauses give legal expression to the conviction that a conscientious physician's non-participation in a referral is not to be interpreted as patient abandonment or obstructionism, but as a considered response to a serious ethical disagreement about what is in the patient's best interests. When faced with such a disagreement, physicians should engage their patients in a respectful and honest dialogue that explains their reasoning and does not deny patients the freedom to disagree and seek treatment from another physician. Such dialogue will open up deep questions about what health is and what the goals of medicine should be. These questions will reveal to us that shared decision-making between patients and clinicians has an irreducibly moral dynamic that depends on the foundational beliefs and values of the persons involved. It's one of my concerns as a physician in this society is that many patients and citizens in our society do not understand this. That when you go to see a doctor, you're actually engaging in a moral dynamic. You're not simply going to a service, one size fits all, as if this is somehow a straightforward, almost vending machine opportunity, right? It's like baking bread. You get out of it what you put into it, all right? In the years ahead, questions of conscience promise to become more frequent and complicated because of the unceasing march of biotechnology, the encroachment of notions of health that are socially constructed, and because of consumerist tendencies that blur the distinction between a medical need and a personal preference. To navigate this complexity, we need practical wisdom, courage, and love for our neighbors as we strive to preserve a practice of medicine that conforms to what is truly conducive to human flourishing. And when we do so under the banner of conscientious practice, we should know that we are helping our world remember that there is indeed something sacred about conscience in the sense that conscience is endowed by our Creator to help us reflect His truth, goodness, and beauty into this world. When we genuinely live according to this God-given endowment, we attend, as Ratzinger said, in some way to the voice of God within us, and thereby pay heed to a moral standard that is above and prior to any human law. And when we do so, we will be reminding our world that God, not the state, is our true and ultimate sovereign. Thank you.
Before I introduce our second speaker, I also want to acknowledge Professor Solomon, who I didn't notice had walked into the room. He's, for anyone who doesn't know, he's the reason we're here today. He founded the Center for Ethics and Culture. If he didn't create this conference, I think he did. He certainly grew it to what it is today, one of the most preeminent conferences in the world dealing with philosophical and theological issues. And beyond his keen mind, for anyone who hasn't had the great privilege of meeting him, he's one of the most hospitable people I have ever met in my life. He's one of those rare individuals who, when you speak to him, you feel like you're the only thing that's important to him, and you always know you have his full attention. And it's really a remarkable quality. So he's not only a man of great intellect, but one that deserves a lot of credit for having created what's here today. So I'd like to acknowledge him. Thank you. Thank you, David. Our next speaker, Christopher Ostertag. Chris is a very humble fellow who only managed to send us about a one-line bio, although there's far, far more to him than he acknowledged, and I went Googling for a few facts so that I'd have something to say. He's a doctoral student in theology and healthcare ethics at St. Louis University. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree at Rockhurst University and a Master's of Philosophy at Texas A&M. His research interests include many, but to mention just a few: Thomistic metaphysics, the Catholic moral tradition, disability, and genetics. And the last two in particular have a special meaning in his life, which I discovered when I came across just an absolutely beautiful reflection, a very poignant essay he wrote. I think it was just recently published, about the birth of his son Hans, who suffers from a genetic condition, but he speaks not of so much of the challenges, but the joy and beauty of Hans's life, what he has learned, and how it's informed his work. And even before meeting Chris, it was clear just from this essay, and I don't know where to find it, he can tell you, but I would encourage you to Google his name and look for it, because it is so clear that this man is grounded in those elements of truth, beauty, and goodness that are so important to all of us. I was really, really moved by his essay. At any rate, his paper is entitled Conscience, Compromise, and Complicity. Chris?
Thank you for the very gracious introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. So a little bit about this project. So this is a paper that I am working on with Jason Eberl, who's my mentor at St. Louis University. And this paper is going to be addressed a little bit more specifically about an objection found in the bioethics literature. And I just want to say, Loris, thank you for the wonderful reflection on conscience, and it was a truly beautiful paper, and I hope that this paper can be as of the same interest to the crowd, but it will be a rather a tighter argument about a very specific issue, but very much in the same vein as what Loris had to say. Definitions of conscience range from its being some sort of moral feeling or intuition to its being an intellectual faculty by which one arrives at reasoned moral judgments. The latter definition can be traced back historically to thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas. In order to appreciate the distinctness of conscience for Aquinas and the Catholic tradition, we must first give a brief account of natural law. Aquinas famously states that the first precept of natural law is that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Other natural law principles can be then derived by considering what contributes to human flourishing. Whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good or evil belongs to the precepts of the natural law as something to be done or avoided. Aquinas cites several natural inclinations towards specific goods for human beings, including the preservation of life, knowledge of God, and living in society. One might object that being naturally inclined to some end does not entail that such an end is good. Aquinas contends, though, that human beings are naturally inclined towards what is good, since all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted on them, they derive their respective inclination to their proper acts and ends. In other words, for an inclination to be natural to a human being means precisely that such an inclination aims at some good for us, since the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law. Aquinas maintains a distinction between speculative and practical reason, the former concerned with knowledge of necessary truths, and the latter with how one ought to act in a particular situation. Both speculative and practical reasoning are aided by natural habits of the human soul, understanding of principles and synderesis, respectively. Synderesis is the natural habit through which we can know the universal principles of the natural law. Furthermore, as a natural habit, synderesis is said to incite good and to murmur at evil, inasmuch as though first principles we proceed to discover and judge of what we have discovered. In warning against evil and inclining us towards good, synderesis cannot err. If human beings are naturally inclined towards good, and likewise possess a natural habit that identifies the principles of natural law, how do we make sense of error and bad judgment? Here is where we must turn our attention to conscience. According to Aquinas, conscience is an application of knowledge to some particular case. Conscience is an act, not a habit or power, and as an application of knowledge, in particular cases, conscience can, and often does, err. Aquinas illustrates how conscience can err using a syllogism. The major premise: I must not do anything which is forbidden by the law of God. Minor premise: sexual intercourse with this woman is forbidden by the law of God. Conclusion: I must abstain from this intercourse. In this syllogism, the judgment of synderesis supplies the major premise, knowledge of higher reasoning presents the minor premise, and conscience dictates the conclusion. Errors can occur in the minor premise, which is supplied by either higher or lower reasoning, or in the conclusion. Given that conscience can err, Aquinas differentiates the ways in which a correct and false conscience bind us. The former binds us absolutely and for intrinsic reason, while the latter binds us for an extrinsic reason. vis-a-vis the correctness one mistakenly believes is present. The correctness one mistakenly believes is present. Since Aquinas holds that conscience binds, yet can err, he must address whether one is morally culpable for a false conscience. Aquinas argues that ignorance can render an act involuntary, thereby removing its character of good or evil, if of some relevant circumstance and without negligence. If, however, one's ignorance is willed, either directly or indirectly through negligence, the resultant false conscience does not excuse one's will from being evil. In other words, a person who does evil cannot use the defense of a false conscience if the person was negligent or directly willed to be ignorant of some pertinent truth. Aquinas' view of conscience must be understood within the broader Thomistic framework of natural law and practical reasoning. While many today construe conscience as a subjective feeling and defend a right to conscientious refusal based merely on whether a person sincerely feels that some act would be wrong for them to do, Aquinas situates conscience within reason. Furthermore, conscience binds one's will, meaning that one cannot decide to act even against a false conscience without sinning. To avoid being guided by a false conscience, Aquinas emphasizes the importance of informing oneself of the precepts of natural law, which can be known by any human being absent certain impediments. The Catholic Church has frequently preached the importance of conscience and the conditions for conscientious refusal. Paul VI says that man perceives and acknowledges the imperatives of the divine law through the mediation of conscience, and that in all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God, the end and purpose of life. John Paul II teaches that conscience, in a certain sense, confronts man with the law and becomes a witness for man, a witness of his own faithfulness or unfaithfulness with regard to the law. He continues, the importance of this interior dialogue of man with himself can never be adequately appreciated, but it is also a dialogue of man with God, the author of the law, the primordial image and final end of man. These passages reiterate the distinctively Catholic understanding of conscience found that can also be traced back to Aquinas. Conscience cannot be taken apart from the law, natural law, and ultimately eternal law, as it is an act of applying general knowledge of the law to particular cases. John Paul II refers to conscience as the proximate norm of personal morality and emphasizes that the judgment of conscience does not establish the law, but rather it bears witness to the authority of the natural law and of the practical reason with reference to the supreme good. Again, the distinctive character of conscience described here is substantially different from a mere subjective feeling or judgment. John Paul II notes that one is helped in the formation of conscience by the magisterial pronouncements of the Church concerning moral questions. Such an understanding of conscience is much more robust than many contemporary debates on the role of conscience in healthcare indicate. However, it will be helpful to defend claims to conscientious refusal in healthcare against one of the most prominent critiques, namely that claims to conscientious refusal are incompatible with professional obligations of physicians. A primary complaint among defenders of this so-called incompatibility thesis is that conscientious refusals are typically based on religious grounds. And for this, I'm thinking of the work of Julian Savulescu and Udo Schucklink and others who have written a lot about this so-called incompatibility thesis. Although it may be descriptively true that most claims of conscientious refusal are, in fact, religiously based, it does not follow that such refusals are not also grounded in defensible rationale, suitable for debate in the Rawlsian public square. This is especially the case in the Roman Catholic objections to directly intended abortions or physician-assisted suicide. With respect to abortion, Catholic authorities rely on current data regarding embryological development and the intrinsic genetically based potential of human embryos and fetuses to develop themselves within a supportive environment into more fully actualized persons. The Catholic Church even admits that it cannot be demonstrably proven that a human person's existence begins at conception, yet relies on a combination of reasonable arguments that a human person does begin her existence at conception, and a precautionary principle that stipulates we ought not risk harming entities which may in fact be persons. With respect to physician-assisted suicide, the Catholic perspective is largely informed by a triple indictment of suicide found in Aquinas. Based on duties one owes to oneself, anticipating a later argument against suicide by Immanuel Kant, to one's community, echoing an argument originally given by Aristotle, and to God. While each of these arguments is contestable, only the last is strictly theologically based. Furthermore, arguments against physician-assisted suicide have also been mounted among secular bioethicists. Daniel Callahan, for instance, argues that euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide do not fall within the proper scope of medical practice, which is essentially to heal broken bodies. Dan Solmesi et al. Also mount a series of non-faith-based arguments against physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. For one, such practices obviate the distinction between valuing persons who have incalculable moral value and valuing interests which may be comparatively valued and thereby lead to utilitarian outcomes that have a long history of critics, such as Elizabeth Anscombe. Specifically, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide require us to accept that it is morally permissible to act with a specific intention in acting of making a somebody into a nobody, i.e., making them dead. And that's a quote from Solmesi et al. Instead, the terminally ill especially need to be reminded of their value, their intrinsic dignity, at the time of fierce doubt. They need to know that their ultimate value does not depend on their appearance, productivity, or independence. Purely religiously based conscientious refusals may lead to problematic outcomes, particularly when claimants are not even aware of their rational foundations, if any, for the religious proscriptions to which they are adhering, or worse, misunderstand or misapply what their religion teaches. For instance, there is nothing in authoritative Catholic teaching that would exhort physicians not to utilize cesarean section for obstructed pregnancies out of a concern that women should be restricted from having, quote, the maximum number of children possible in the future. And that's a quote from Savalescu and Shuklink. First of all, the Catholic Church does not teach that women ought to have the maximum number of children possible, and in fact encourages the practice of responsible parenthood, which may require limiting one's procreative activity with regard to physical, economic, psychological, and social conditions. It's from Paul VI. Second, even though the Catholic Church condemns elective sterilization as a means of intentionally avoiding contraception, if an otherwise legitimate medical procedure risks, or even is foreseen to cause with certainty, a sterilizing side effect, such a procedure may still be justified by appeal to the principle of double effect. It is also worth noting that the Catholic perspective is not monolithic with respect to various prescriptions regarding healthcare services. For instance, it is currently contested among Catholic bioethicists whether emergency contraception could be administered to rape victims based on whether the primary mechanism of action is merely contraceptive or potentially abortifacient. Whether conjoined twins may be surgically separated when it is foreseen that one of them will die upon separation, or whether medically provided nutrition and hydration may be illicitly withdrawn from a patient in a persistent vegetative state, among other issues. Any discussion on conscience in Catholic healthcare is not complete without elaborating on moral complicity and scandal. Recall the first precept of natural law demands that we do good and avoid evil. In practice, many human actions have more than one effect. Furthermore, a human being does not act in isolation from others, and in many instances, the actions of multiple agents are interconnected. When one agent's action, which is good, intersects with another agent's action, which is evil, we must carefully distinguish between licit and illicit cooperation in evil. The basis for this distinction rests in the intention of the first agent and the distance between the first agent's good act and the other's evil action. Formal cooperation in evil occurs when an agent approves of another's evil action and may be either explicit or implicit. In the former, An agent directly intends to cooperate in another's evil for the end of the act itself. In the latter, an agent intends to cooperate in evil not for the end of the evil act as such, but rather for the end of some other concurrent good. Both explicit and implicit formal cooperation are illicit. Material cooperation occurs when an agent is instrumental in another's evil action without themselves approving of the action itself. Material cooperation can be illicit, but only if sufficiently removed from the evil action. If the material cooperation is immediate, meaning that the agent is essential for the commission of the evil action, then it is illicit. If the material cooperation is mediate, meaning that the agent is not necessary for the commission of the evil action, then it may be licit. If, however, the immediate material cooperation is proximate, meaning that the agent is directly causally instrumental in the commission of the evil action, it is illicit. But if the immediate material cooperation is remote, meaning that the agent is indirectly causally instrumental in the commission of the evil action, the cooperation may be licit, provided there is proportionate reason for engaging in such cooperation. To illustrate the principle of cooperation, consider two recent cases involving a mandate from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, implemented as part of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, that coverage for contraception be included in any employer-based healthcare insurance plans. In the first case, the Little Sisters of the Poor objected to file the EBSA Form 700 as part of an accommodation offered by the HHS for religious institutions to opt out of the contraceptive mandate, thereby triggering an alternative means of coverage provided by a third party for employees to obtain contraception. The sisters argued that filling the opt-out form would result in their being complicit in moral wrongdoing. David Oderberg, however, counters that the very purpose of an opt-out mechanism is to provide a means for an objector not to be a cooperator in an immoral act. It seems absurd on its face, then, should reasonable interpretation of the mechanism entail that it too involves illicit cooperation. We agree with Oderberg that opting out of the contraception mandate via the EBSA Form 700 constitutes remote immediate material cooperation in evil. In the second case, the president of the University of Notre Dame recently announced that the university insurance plan would cover non-abortifacient contraceptives rather than take advantage of the HHS accommodation that uses a third party to cover contraception. A supportive rationale is that a university-funded plan that covered non-abortifacient contraceptives would be far less objectionable than utilizing a third-party plan that also covered abortifacients. In this case, it may be read in one way as involving immediate material cooperation, since Notre Dame is directly providing insurance coverage for non-abortifacient contraceptives. It also may be arguably be construed as involving implicit formal cooperation, insofar as Notre Dame's decision is justified in part by emphasizing the difference between non-abortifacient and abortifacient contraceptives. In other words, Notre Dame seems to be implicitly formally cooperating in the evil of non-abortifacient contraceptives to avoid a more remote material cooperation in abortifacient contraceptives supplied by a third party. Another relevant factor in the moral evaluation of these and other instances of cooperation, even when illicit, is the risk of scandal. Aquinas defines scandal as something less rightly done or said that occasions another's spiritual or moral downfall, and occurs when one man by his injunction, inducement, or example moves another to sin. He further specifies two types of scandal, active and passive scandal. Active scandal occurs when a man either intends or by his evil word or deed to lead when a man intends by his word or deed to lead another man into sin, or if he does not so intend, when his deed is of such a nature as to lead another into sin. For instance, when a man publicly commits a sin or does something that has the appearance of sin. Passive scandal occurs when one neither intends to lead another into sin, nor does what is of a nature to lead another into sin, and yet this other one, through being ill-disposed, is led into sin. Aquinas contends that active scandal is always an occasion of moral wrongdoing on the part of the agent who scandalizes another, while passive scandal may not entail moral wrongdoing on the agent's part so long as the word or action that led to another's moral downfall was good in itself. With this understanding of cooperation and scandal in mind, we return to the question of referral. On the one hand, a physician who refers a patient for an illicit service appears to formally cooperate in evil insofar as the cooperation is intended by virtue of referral. Yet, one could argue that, given our current healthcare and insurance schema, the process of referral is inevitable since patients often need referral from their primary care provider in order to receive coverage for healthcare services from another provider. The referring provider is not actually intending to cooperate, but is simply operating within an extant system. Furthermore, if we consider the distance between the provider who refers and the commission of the evil act, there are often several mediating agents, including the patient and the other provider. The cooperation may thus be either proximate or remote, depending on the kind of service. At the very least, it does not seem to be immediate. Considering the potential for scandal, referral is likewise nuanced. On the one hand, the act of referral appears to be merely passive scandal, since the inducement of another to sin is clearly outside of both the referring provider's intention and the nature of the action preferred, i.e. referral. Yet if the referral constitutes formal cooperation, for instance, a physician employed by a Catholic hospital who morally approves of abortion, then active scandal would be implicated. Even within the context of referral, a Catholic provider may actively counter any risk of scandal by witnessing to the moral truth through making clear to patients the reasons why they refuse to offer such objectionable services while hopefully maintaining their overall care relationship. In conclusion, claims to conscience rooted in the Catholic tradition can avoid many of the criticisms leveled against such claims generally because they are not essentially faith-based, rather supported by publicly defensible reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we have about 15 minutes or 20 minutes for questions. So I'll entertain any questions you have. Yes.
That was wonderful, thank you. I'm Kristen Holly, I'm an internist at the University of Michigan, and I'm the director of a program there on health, spirituality, and religion at the medical school. And last year we hosted a debate on conscience protection. It was probably our best attended debate of the year. And one of the arguments that came up against conscience protection and the right of the physician was the idea of how our residents are funded through CMS. And that's public money that are funding our GME education. And so does the society have a contract or a claim on us because of the way that we were funded to provide services? It's not about us, even though there's this conflict or this, as you talked about so beautifully, this the state versus sort of God and the sovereignty and how we are aligned to God, but not in a silo. We have this other party that's involved. So how do you reconcile the way that we're funded with this claim of society on us because of that type of funding in our development?
I appreciate how important that question is. And there is this, not in the classical philosophical sense, this idea of a social contract. And there's even a literature in the medical literature about the mutual rights and obligations between the medical profession and society at any of a number of levels. So I take that for granted, that we have obligations. And as I even explained to medical students in my own experience, when I was a medical student, I remember, shall we say, being very aware of my own sweat equity in becoming a doctor. And I had this very false notion of thinking it was all my hard effort that was responsible for my becoming a doctor. And then you grow older and wiser and you realize that there's no way that any of us could have ever pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Okay, so we are indebted to our communities, to our society, to the economic structures that allow us to go forward. I'd even say that perhaps there might even be a connection here between the way that Alistair McIntyre talks about the difference between a practice and an institution that houses that practice and the constant tensions, irremovable tensions that will exist between those. So all of that I will grant as a background to saying, yeah, it's challenging. Having said that, I think the whole idea of accommodation, it's interesting how that word has resonances in different parts of our society. We talk about accommodating various needs of people who have them in our society. To me, maybe the question is, where should the burden of responsibility and action be placed? Because I think it might be a little too easy to simply say, somebody's paying for something, therefore. Wait a minute, I think the prior question is, how important is the thing we're talking about? And I think one of the concerns, of course, that neither of us have really talked about yet is the potential that some people who are less supportive of conscientious practice in certain ways might fear that it will be misused and mishandled, right? That people will just, whatever their idiosyncratic reasons for not wanting to do something, for instance, like when the AIDS epidemic unfolded, there were certain doctors who apparently said, I don't want to take care of AIDS patients, and I shouldn't have to. Well, why? Okay, so you could see there's a real history of the misuse of certain kinds of prerogatives. So where does that leave us? I think we have to then rely upon reason-inclusive notions of conscience that allow us to explain to each other how serious something this is and how that seriousness attaches to whatever language works best for our audience, our moral core, our integrity, etc. And then to say, can we not reason together? Can we not work this out? And then, where I would also want to go with this, and I think that might be a little additional contrast to maybe some of the angles you were taking, Christopher, is that I have very much appreciated over the years benefiting from an essay by a Professor Reeder from Brown University, I believe now retired, but he wrote in the Journal of Religious Ethics an essay called What is a Religious Ethic? And so there, this question of the fact that is it that there's one group of us who consider ourselves religiously based, are we somehow exceptional compared to everyone else? Reeder would argue that everyone comes from somewhere and is standing upon claims, assumptions, foundations about what they take to be ultimately real and ultimately good. And so if one starts to try to level the field of discussion to say, wait a minute, it's really, in one sense, it's more about who happens to be in the majority or in power who gets to set the rules. So why is it, for instance, you have the curiosity in this country right now where, depending upon what state you're a resident in, the question of assisted suicide does or doesn't come up? Are we going to say that these fundamental matters are simply going to be idiosyncratically dependent upon which jurisdiction you happen to live in? Well, maybe there's something deeper and broader. So this is a long-winded way of saying I hear the question and concern, but I think what it really does is it causes us to ask, how serious is this question? And my hunch is that the way the issue gets treated from the other side is often because they're not willing to grant how serious this really is for those of us who believe it is that serious. You want to?
I mean, something related that, I think about in the few classes that I have taught at SLU, mostly nursing students, but some medical students, and I'm always disheartened at how ingrained this idea is that sort of the practice of medicine is divorced from religion, from morality. It's just, it's a day job, You're going into this profession, you're learning how to do things, and personal beliefs and opinions and rationales don't really have a place to play. So I think all this to say, in the approach that I'm taking in this, that Jason and I are taking in this paper, we're sort of responding to a very specific critique that's leveled against the claims to conscience, but really the problem is much more fundamental than just, whether claims to conscience are essentially faith-based or reason-based, because it's really about the, how ingrained in the practice of medicine itself is theology, is philosophy, are these deeper questions that aren't being acknowledged. So it's like we're trying to find a way to sort of have that conversation within, to a secular audience. But it's, little steps at a time.
Richard?
I was about to ask a question, but let me get my down-to-earth legal answer to the interesting question that was raised here. CMS is barred by law from discriminating against those who have conscientious objections. The biggest range of laws have to do with abortion, but there are other laws that relate to other things. If the institution wants to follow the policy of CMS, it will not discriminate against those people either. I think it's a false conflict in terms of what the federal law says. I can send my compendium to you. But the question I wanted to ask was, I'm not familiar with the Ontario court decision. I was wondering how they managed to say that the doctor's religious freedom is trumped by the demand for public health and safety, but what they're refusing to refer for is the killing of that patient who is not healthier after being killed. So what argument do they make for that?
Well, I found a certain irony in that language as well when they talked about safety and public health, et cetera. I didn't go into all the details about, even at the beginning parts of that decision, they talked about the different clinical scenarios that were the focus of concern. So in all of the litigants' cases, abortion and euthanasia were a concern. In some, there was sterilization and other issues, contraception as well. But my hunches, what they probably had in mind, were cases of pregnancy where the life of the mother is at stake in some sense, depending upon the clinical assessment at the bedside. So that would I'm just trying to, give all benefit of the doubt to the concern regarding public health. But I completely agree that this actually raises profound questions, even that I tried to end on, to say that it raises what notions of health are we working with to begin with, and what are the roles of medicine. But that is certainly something that we need to continue to ask our colleagues on the other side of this question, explain to us what this has to do with health and safety.
Yes.
I'd like to just offer a comment, maybe a question about the California experience of physician-assisted suicide. I practiced there as it became legal, and I left actually the state due to those concerns. And some people have said to me, well, were you specifically forced to participate? And I'm a hospice and palliative physician. I said, well, no, but untangling myself from my system is very complicated. We practice medicine as not solo individuals in many cases, but as part of teams, and they are not just interdisciplinary, but multidisciplinary. And although the law is clear that a physician decides for his or herself their participation, it's really not reflective of the reality of being part of an institutional practice where there are this word called stakeholders that I became familiar with, and the tangling of these policies institutionally are very complex. Just to make a note of that, so what's being published from Stanford, Stephanie Harmon, David Magnus, Barbara Koenig from UCSF, are all saying early experiences it's incredibly difficult to balance an institution's decision to participate with the individual consciences of the actual people involved. And I find that language that an institution has decided to participate incredibly problematic in terms of recognizing what is really the role of any one individual in an institution. For example, if an institution had 0 physicians who wanted to participate, how would that institution participate? It's just incredibly contradictory. So I just really appreciate so much what you're doing, your work, your comments, your teaching, your education. I'm still struggling with this question, how would a person fit into an institution where it's not just a matter of what you decide as a person, it's how you fit into a larger system.
Sorry, your name again?
Nicole.
Nicole, so I don't know, I hope everyone heard what Nicole was saying, but most striking about it is how she herself left California in large part because of the change. It was the reason. Yeah. And it speaks for itself, right? This is how serious this is. And I had occasion, speaking of the Ontario case, to go to the joint meeting of the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Canada and the Catholic Medical Association of Canada, which was held in Halifax this last summer. And I was able to meet 2 of the physicians who were 2 of the 5 litigants, as well as some of the people leading the legal effort there. And to hear our Canadian colleagues talk about, they use the word oppressive, especially in Ontario and in British Columbia. And what's interesting, there are also differences between different Canadian provinces. And so those kinds of differences remind us of how local, at different levels and different dimensions these questions become, and how important it is that individual institutions reckon with and wrestle with and have the dialogue and deliberation in as collegial a way as possible, so that these issues can be put on the table and people can know where they stand. I find it interesting to sometimes hear about colleagues who are at different hospitals around this country and to hear them talk about what policies they do or don't have regarding conscientious practice. And they differ between institutions. So this is extremely important. Another example might be that you probably know this work. There was a publication by Courtney Campbell and another author from, he's in Oregon, but they did an analysis of practices and policies in hospices in the state of Washington regarding physician-assisted suicide. And it was striking. The spectrum of how things are handled is really, really notable. And so individuals and institutions and clinical operations are wrestling with this. And I think increasingly, for those of you who are undergraduates interested in a career in medicine, or medical students in the room, or residents, you will have choices. We all have choices to make, and you might even decide to train or to live and work in a particular jurisdiction where you have, though God only knows what will unfold in the future, you'll have perhaps the opportunity to practice in a way that is more likely to be consistent with the kinds of beliefs and values that you would like to operationalize in your actual work.
You seem to raise a question I'd be interested to ask either of you. Implicit in what you were saying was the question of, can an institution have moral standing in opposition to one of the persons that is part of that institution? I mean, can an institution have moral standing? An institution is not a human being, let alone an organism. You know, it's a collection of people.
Yeah, so I was going to bring this up. So earlier this fall, I was on a panel about conscientious action in healthcare at SLU, and I gave a presentation similar to this, and then someone who works as an ethicist within Catholic healthcare gave a presentation about institutional Catholic identity and institutional conscience. But the third panelist was not a Christian and was thinking as sort of a secular individual with secular values who is employed by a religiously affiliated institution. Because you sort of get that same tension from the other side of, you know, an individual's claim to conscience for, you know, with respect to their own values, secular values, but there's sort of this tension between the institutional identity and mission of the hospital. And what came out in the presentation and in the discussion afterwards was we should really be careful and make some certain distinctions here. So we often think of conscientious refusal or objection in sort of a negative sense, you know, refusing or objecting to do something. But from the other point of view, from the secular point of view, he was thinking as a secular physician in a Catholic hospital who wants to perform, you know, euthanasia, abortion, or what have you. So in a sense, it's like a positive claim. But then we need to be careful, because then we have to ask whether this is a negative or positive right for that positive claim to conscience. So there's nothing prohibiting that individual from leaving and opening up a clinic where they can do this, provided it's legal in their state. But it's not a positive right insofar as, because of that claim of the individual, the hospital is then required to provide the means for the individual to carry out their claim to conscience. But I think the question of institutional identity is definitely wrapped up in all of this. Yeah.
I just wanted to make one comment. I'm a practicing surgeon in Indianapolis, and Nicole's comments ring true to me. What I wanted to raise sort of the alarm is that even here in Indiana, which is not a state that has physician-assisted suicide as being legal, I'm seeing among practicing physicians in our hospital a creep towards this as to how things are done on a day-to-day basis. Words such, or phrases such as aid in dying, etc., are starting to creep in, and things are being done outside of institutional policy that are very difficult for certain other practitioners to deal with. And although we talk about the certain states that have this legalized, I think this is starting to creep in other places around the country, even in a state such as Indiana, where we would not expect this to be happening.
You know, to me, it's interesting what you say. It reminds me of even a report I saw that was describing how in the state of Oregon, and Oregon, as some of you will well know, it was the first state to legalize assisted suicide in this country, and they also have a government website that reports their annual and cumulative data that they collect by law and report that, so you can read about that online. But I also learned recently that there was a successful move to change even the language of the statute, what it's called. And so if I recall correctly, assisted suicide is no longer in the language. So the rhetoric of the discussion itself has a certain force. And it's right that Courtney Campbell article I was referring to, it describes how in these different hospices across the state of Washington, there were, I think, 6 or 7 different wordings for the thing itself. And I think that usually is a clue to where someone stands. In fact, some people believe that even reference of physician-assisted suicide the connotation is so negative and derogatory, it's unkind of people like myself to use that phrase. I continue to use it because I think it's honest. I think that's what the action is. And that's what I also try to communicate to the medical students where I happen to teach.
We had staff meetings on that exact topic where we were advised to not use that term.
I mean, that is really striking, isn't it? When things get to the point where you're being told how to speak.
Father?
So being from the other side of the Atlantic, I think the question of language is very, very important. There was a move a number of years ago to drop the use of the word conscience entirely and to replace it in the kind of General Medical Council's guidance by personal belief or values. And I do think even in the secular world, this day and age, conscience still has a stronger claim on most people than when you substitute particularly the idea of personal belief and values. And to oppose any situation where people do want to change and manipulate the language, because it does, I feel certainly make it much more difficult to defend the issues of conscience in the kind of more wider debates that we have to have, and where the word conscience itself is important for us to take.
Can I just say that, just to hear what you think, there's a book by a man named Langston. It was published by Penn State University Press on conscience, and I can send that reference. It's a very helpful historical review and analysis of what conscience is. And one of the things that I have learned after spending a fair amount of time on this topic over the years is that if I'm ever having a discussion with someone on conscience, we should first tell each other what we mean by the word, because people have been meaning different things for over 2,000 years on this topic. And I myself have so much appreciated how in the Catholic tradition specifically, that tight association between moral, practical reasoning and conscience is such a powerful entry into the connection between conscience and ethics specifically. And I think one of my recommendations is never lose hold of that connection. Because if we continue to have these discussions by saying to our interlocutors, we're talking about an ethical disagreement here, that gains a certain traction because, well, bioethics is all about ethical disagreements and discussions and moving toward consensus. The moment some people want to marginalize conscience as this private matter, it's a way to try to bracket it off and basically not have to deal with the ethical disagreement at hand.
Loris grew up in the tradition of John Calvin, he's such a great intellect and a great Christian. I just wish he'd walk down the street and join our team.
Since Phil brought this matter up, let me just say, having been raised on the other side of the Reformation, if I can put it that way, it's been entirely edifying for me to learn and to grow through learning about the role of reason and its relationship to faith in the Catholic tradition. And I think so that even the C.D. Broad philosophical 3 dimensions, reason, emotion, and motivation, I think that connects very helpfully into the, if I may, would you agree, with the Catholic tradition? Whereas there are certain, if you read that book by Langston, you read certain Protestant sort of traditions, and there's a different flavor to conscience. I think the Catholic flavor, if I could put it that way, is very helpful for our current time. So I sit here in gratitude.
Well, and I to you. If I find you at the Basilica, I'm going to flick some holy water on you. But anyway, it's 10:15. It's time to call an end to this session. But perhaps Loris and Chris could stay up here for a couple of minutes if there's, in case anyone wants to ask some follow-up questions. Thank you so much, and in particular, thank you to our great panelists.